You have now entered the no friend zone. Shalom, 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 family, peace and blessings. Shalom to you, that's Rob in the building. Peace, family. Peace to you, King. Giving all praise to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. To the God of Israel. To the God of the world of Israel. For those who should join themselves along with Israel and join themselves to the law, according to Isaiah chapter 56, those who shall have a name as worthy as Israel. Peace and blessings to you, family, to the diaspora of Israel, and those who sojourn with Israel, whether by blood, through conversion, shalom to you. And I'm going to get right into it. I got about an hour-long teaching. All praise to the Most High. on something that I heard that I felt was definitely worthy to do on the bring on the No Friend Zone podcast here. If you haven't noticed, I have several podcasts. I have the New Torah Movement podcast. I have the No Friend Zone podcast, and peace and blessings to those, and shout out to those who have come along and sent your appreciation for this particular podcast. Then I'm going to continue to build upon sharing the information. No dogma, no drama over here. We're strictly dealing with the information. And we're going to deal with today a cultural and linguistic comparative analysis of Devarim for Deuteronomy chapter 28 and the Esarhaddon vassal treaty and other ancient Near Eastern treaties. And the reason why I decided to do this lesson, because as you travel these YouTube streets, very often you're going to step in something. You're going to step in some, if anybody's ever been to New Orleans in the French Quarter, especially during the time of Mardi Gras, they have the cobblestone streets there in the French Quarter. And, very few cars travel. That street is blocked off to, vehicle traffic. So a lot of the police in the area, as they're patrolling the street, they patrol on horseback. And if you are not careful, you may just step in a pile of horse manure, right? Or as we used to say as children growing up, sugar, honey, ice, and tea. You might step in that. You're not very careful, right? And as you walk these YouTube streets, you have to watch where you step, because you just may find yourself walking and stepping in somebody else's horse crap. And but you get, the longer you're around these people, you get to navigate yourself. You know where the landmines are. You know where not to walk, how to navigate, what to walk through. You know who is going to be dropping tons of horse crap once you hear them pop up and they fire their channels up and their platforms get going. You pretty much know you're getting ready to stink up the place, right? And how they're about to do it. So you'll come across these people. And again, I talked about the other day the disinformation cell groups that are rampant, especially in the unconscious community. They'll simply say anything just to manipulate the minds of those who they feel are inferior to them or weaker than they are, who may not be as intelligent as they are. But it's really none of that. Is more so that they feel like you're not as crafty, or you're not as you're more gullible, I should say, right, with the information. So they don't expect a lot of people to fact check them. And the sad part about it is that a lot of people won't fact check. So when you hear things, a lot of things that they say, sometimes the things that they say go over people's heads, and they expect it to. Sometimes they know people are going to parrot what they say and don't really validate their information, and they will. That will happen. But it's all a tactic. It's all a tactic of manipulation, right? And they manipulate a lot of information, right? And one of the things that I've heard recently, I had to jot it down and make a note of it and say, listen, I got to deal with this. Because if I hear something once, that's really incredible. And when I say incredible, I don't mean like I'm fascinated by it to a degree, but incredible in the fact that it's not credible. It's not credible. And so sometimes when I hear these things, if I hear it once, I'll just jot it down and make a note of it. But if I hear it a second time, then I begin to think, well, I need to, especially when I know it's false information, I need to begin to prepare to deal with this information campaign before it picks up any steam, right? And one of these things I've heard most recently, and it's from a person that I believe leads one of the biggest information cell groups in the YouTube community, and that's the Dagger Squad, right? And Garfield Reed. And one of the things that he said was that Deuteronomy chapter 28 was taken or drawn from the Esarhaddon Treaty. Said it back a couple of weeks back on HOK. Come on in, family. Hit the like button, like, share, subscribe. To the no friend zone. And we're going to deal with that today. We're going to deal with that today. What the scholars and what the evidence actually shows. Right? And the understanding of it is that it's actually occurred in the reverse, that there's ample evidence to show and support that the Esarhaddon treaties, and watch this, people, because I'm going somewhere with this, that the Esarhaddon treaties was more likely influenced by Deuteronomy chapter 28. Now, I will agree, Deuteronomy chapter 28 is what we would call didactic literature, or these treaties that we see occurring often in the ancient Near East, right? I did a series a couple of weeks back in regards to the instructions of Amenemope. Did Proverbs chapters 22, 23, and 24. Is it a copy? And so we have to deal with these things in that manner. So we have to talk about how they attempt to discredit the Bible with false information and try to discredit the Bible as if it's plagiarized or it's a copied work. And so what I wanted to do was show that oftentimes they try to have it both ways. They try to tell you, well, it's taken from ancient Kemet, right? The Bible. It's drawn off ancient Kemet. But then they'll come right back and say, well, Deuteronomy chapter 28 is taken from the Esarhaddon Treaty, where it has nothing to do with any Kemetic dynasty, right? And so let's talk about this. I'm going to get right into it because I'm only going to be about an hour with this, so let me do this. And then I'm going to share my screen. Let me reduce that real quick. I think we should be good right there. I think we should be good right there. Should be able to see that clearly. Shalom, shalom, Yirmiyah. Who is Israel? All praise to the Most High. So I wanted to deal with this really quickly. I'm not going to be before you long. A cultural and linguistic comparative analysis of Deuteronomy chapter 28 and the Esarhaddon vassal treaty and other ancient Near Eastern treaties. A closer look at why Deuteronomy chapter 28 more than likely or actually influenced the Esarhaddon treaty. Let's get into that real quickly. They attempt to be real savvy with their arguments against scripture, right? And their whole basis was to discredit any Israelite paradigm or one of that many consider in the Israelite community one of the staple verses or chapters in the Torah that connects Israelites today from those who follow that narrative, that paradigm, to the children of Israel from the Exodus all the way through the Assyrian captivity, all the way through the Babylonian captivity, all the way to the transatlantic slave trade and to the Americas and where we are today. That is a linchpin of a lot of Black Israelite or Israelite narratives that many hold true today. So their whole argument, especially why Garfield brought this out, was simply to discredit Israelites and saying, look, your Bible is not dictated by the Most High. It's not genuine simply because Deuteronomy chapter 28 is taken from the Esarhaddon treaties. Esarhaddon vassal treaties. This is the claim that he makes. And the reason why I'm doing this study is to show that when they say these things, they expect you not to follow up or challenge their statements or their arguments. Many times, what occurs is that because a lot of us in the Israelite community, I'm going to put myself in there, a lot of us in the Israelite community, even though I don't practice this, but a lot of us in the Israelite community don't ascribe to chronologies outside of the biblical narrative. We don't deal with the sciences outside of the biblical narrative. Archaeology is a science, it's a study in a specific field. Sociology, linguistics, right? These things are sciences. And it is these sciences that we can rely on to aid us in our studies and in our refutations against a lot of this disinformation that comes out of these groups, i.e., like Garfield and the Dagger Squad and others, right? I think one of the next shows I'm going to do is I'm going to show that in the discussion that I had on the Dagger Squad platform before, where I spoke with who they claim is one of their master teachers to a degree, right? A gentleman by the name of Russell Gmerkin, right? Who claims not who does not have a PhD. I asked him that specifically. Who claims not to be a linguist or claims not to be a scholar, but he basically told me that, listen, I'm not a professor. I'm simply a library rat. And this is my take on the biblical narrative and how I believe that a lot of what's in it was not true. And it was written around the 4th century BCE, most of it, because this is the first time we hear Moses mentioned outside of the biblical record, right? And so he makes this claim, and it's just a claim. It's a theory. He has no evidence for it. It's a theory. But my problem was that as I'm engaged in the Dagger Squad, many of them, and they're not the only ones that do this, but many of them said, listen, Mr. Gmerkin, they began to praise him for bringing them out of the Hebrew Israelite faith because of this theoretical book that he wrote. He clearly tells you that it's all theory. It's what he believes. They give him credit for this, and that this disinformation, this book full of disinformation by Russell Gmerkin was passed around as if it was evident, as if it was proof, as if it was something that they really should have adhered to. So I question even their faith in the first place, or their understanding or belief system in the first place. That something or work as weak as this is that Russell Gmerkin puts out, easily debunkable, right? Persuaded them to walk away from the Most High, to leave behind keeping of the law, statutes, and commandments. So I often hear these things from people, from these disinformation cell groups, and it's story after story after story of these things. And what happens is people are dismayed and persuaded because they hear an argument, and because Israelites are not equipped to address them, not just from a biblical standard, but from a scientific standard. A lot of times what I attempt to do is to get in that scientific ring with them and say, hey, look, let's look at what the science actually says. Because as I'm reading it and as I'm studying it, it doesn't say what you say it says. And so right there, I know what you're attempting to do is manipulate the minds of the people. And some people who are weak-minded are drawn away. They're easily drawn away. Why? Because they don't have the necessary tools or the information just to have enough to push back and say, you know what? I heard what you're saying, but I also know this, or this is the information, or this is where you got that information, or this is where you gleaned that information. This is the argument against the disinformation. See, they don't want you to bring out anything that goes against the disinformation, because once you do that, now they have to scramble. I knew this old gentleman years ago. He said, he always used to say, never try to straighten out a lie. It's like a piece of elbow macaroni. If you try to straighten it out, it'll just break into many pieces. And then all you have is a bunch of little lies. And so what I say to that is, yeah, don't try to straighten out the lie. Cook it. Boil it. Get into the information and study it, and let's break it down that way. We ain't got to try to break up a dry lie. Let's just make it a wet noodle and smash it that way. That's how we should deal with this information, right? And so when I heard Garfield say, oh, you guys claim to be Israelites, you guys are fake and phonies because Deuteronomy chapter 28, a lot of you would like to make that claim that that's part of your identity. You identify with the curses, and you guys are fakes and phony because Deuteronomy chapter 28 is taken from the Esarhaddon vassal treaty. Well, hold on, Jim Shoe. Hold on. Let's see if what you're actually saying is true. The first thing for me is that dating of the book of Deuteronomy, when it was actually written, right? In the Esarhaddon treaties, in the Esarhaddon himself, right? The first glimpses of the books of Deuteronomy that we have in the oldest depictions of it is from what they call the Silver Scrolls, right? It has parts of Deuteronomy in it, right? Which dates to about, let me get it. I know it's well before the Esarhaddon treaties. I want to say at least 400 years before the Esarhaddon treaties, right? The Silver Scrolls. And so that's the first red flag for me when he makes this statement. So I already know he's off. I already know he's making it up. But he's going to depend on the fact that you're not going to go research it as an Israelite. You're not going to go research it. And so they run with these narratives, and then what happens is those who like to follow his narrative, his paradigm, his platform, the brainless ones that follow him, and I call them that because they don't go vet the information, they'll pick it up and they begin to repeat it. And they'll repeat it much so is that they believe that it's fact. And then you'll start to hear from platform to platform to platform. They're parroting now disinformation. So let's look into whether or not Deuteronomy chapter 28 was taken from the Esarhaddon treaties, or does it show us the reverse once we get down into the information? Does Deuteronomy chapter 28 influence the Esarhaddon treaty? Hit that like button, family. Like, share, and subscribe. So let's talk about it, right? Let's get into the evidence of it. Esarhaddon, right? He was king of Assyria, king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad. He had another title, king of the kings of Egypt and Cush. He also carried another title, king of the four corners of the world, and also king of the universe. So Esarhaddon carried all these titles. Esarhaddon, this is the close-up from his victory stele, right? Which is now housed in the Pergamon Museum. He's also considered king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and he reigned from circa 681 to 669 BCE. Esarhaddon is also clearly mentioned by name in the biblical narrative. And let me say this, right? Let's deal with this, right? Let's give y'all some pushback. They often tell us the Bible is not a historical document, right? It's more like a comic book, simply because it names real people in real places, right? I heard Shaka almost try to make an argument last night on the HOK, right? Basically calling it historical fiction. The Bible says historical fiction, and that's why they placed it in the fiction section in their library. Well, that's wholly false. Wholly false, right? But let's get into it, right? Here's the difference. When you read when we're reading the biblical narrative, right? It does mention real places. There's a large majority of archaeological finds and discoveries throughout history, right, that have been made using the biblical text. Using the biblical text. We know this about Jericho. We know this about the Hittite Empire. We know this about a lot of different places that were seemingly unknown to man, but we had an understanding of it. Actually, had been discovered by man. I should say, Shalakia. They had been discovered by man, but only known because of the biblical narrative. And when archaeologists and scientists began to take the Bible and go look in these areas where the Bible clearly states that it was, they began to actually find and discover these places were actually real places, right? These things were recorded in the Bible by real people, right? Now, here's the argument against Shaka Amos when he calls it historical fiction. Why it's wholly argument. People will say, well, the Bible is nothing more than a comic book. Peter Parker, Spider-Man lives in Manhattan and he swings in New York. Is Manhattan, New York a real place? Yeah. But we know Peter Parker is not a real character, right? Right? We know that. So what's the issue with that? What's the issue with saying that? Is that because we know that the author of the comic book Amazing Spider-Man, the creator of the character, whose name is Stan Lee, and up until a few years ago made cameo appearances in all the Marvel movies of all the characters that he had a hand in creating, right? Including the Black Panther, right? We know that Stan Lee, through multiple interviews, through multiple writings of himself, clearly states, these are fictional characters that I created. I made this up. I made up Spider-Man. I made up the X-Men. I made up these characters. And yeah, I placed in my creating these comic books, these false stories. I placed them in real places so they could be more relatable to the people. I made up the Daredevil, right, and placed him in Hell's Kitchen in New York, right, a real place. But I, Stan Lee, attest to the fact that I created these characters. Now, here's the problem when you try to push that same argument onto the biblical narrative. Where's your evidence of anyone or anyone in the Bible stating that they created the characters in the Bible or the people in the Bible? Where's the evidence of that? No one says these things are created. No one from the contemporary of the times. Even if you want to place the Bible at 700 BCE, even if you want to do that, whatever, these writers never state that these people are not real people. They never once make the claim that the people in the biblical story, in the biblical narrative, are not real people, that they are not real places. So comparing it to a comic book is a logical fallacy. It's a false equivalency. It's a very poor argument. And then you have people like Shaka Almost, Almost, try to make this claim. And then most people sit back and they accept that argument as if it has some substance to it. But it wholly does not. It's ridiculous. No writer in the Bible, no prophet in the Bible, no one in the Bible, not even, listen, if people want to say King James created it, or if they want to say Constantine created it, whatever you want to say, created the Bible story and character. They never say that they did. They never say that they made them up. No one ever makes that claim. But again, when you look at DC Comics and Batman, you have Bob Kane, and there's another gentleman whose family just put the estate of Bob Kane to court and said, look, I helped him create the story of Batman. Actually, he got it from me. The story of Wonder Woman, I was reading not too long ago in DC Comics, was written by a man who was married to two women, and the two women were involved in a lesbian relationship. So this is how he came with placing them among the Amazon and the stories of the lesbian. We don't have to see, this is what I'm saying. Right? The Spider-Man comic doesn't have to say that the characters are false. The actual creator of Spider-Man says the characters are false. We don't have that with the Bible. No one in the Bible or any writer of the Bible makes the claim that the characters are false or that they made it up. But we have Stan Lee on video in court proceedings saying that he created these characters. We don't have that with anyone connected to the Bible. That's your problem with the argument. That argument is dead. It's dead. So throw your hands up on that. That's the point that I'm making. So that's why it's a false equivalency. It sounds good, but it's disinformation. And this is what I mean about these disinformation cell groups and these disinformation gurus that we have running rampant, because they come up with arguments that sound really, 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 really good until you get to the bare bones of what it is that they're actually doing and saying. But there is no, and I'm going to address this real quick and I'm going to continue the lesson. But we do have attestations of those. You have many scholars, even when we deal with the New Testament, right? They talk about Paul's letters. We have Paul's letters. Some will argue there were 3 different Pauls. Some will say, well, we have the Paul's letters, but no one says any of Paul's letters weren't authentic. We can confirm the existence of Paul. No one today, they'll argue against the historicity of Jesus, of Yeshua, of Yahushua, before they argue against the authenticity and the historical evidence of Paul. Why? Because we have his letters. The only other letter that we have attributed to Christ himself, or receiving a letter or any type of correspondence, is from an pseudepigrapha story, which talks about the king of Edessa wanted to be healed. He needed to have, he wanted to be healed. He was sick. He wanted to be healed. So apparently he wrote a letter to Yeshua, to Yahushua. He wrote him a letter, and then Yeshua sent him back a correspondence, not handwritten, I don't believe, but he sent him back a correspondence telling him and say, look, I can't make it to you at this moment, because this king of Edessa, this wanted Christ, wanted Yeshua, Yahushua, to actually come and visit him in his kingdom because he was too sick. He was too sick to move. He was too sick to travel and fear for his life. That's an account that does exist in a pseudepigraphal story. I don't give too much credence to it, But if you want to make an argument, is there someone outside of the Bible corresponding with Christ physically or documented? Yeah, there's an argument for that. There's an argument of that. Actually, we have a PhD scholar, Bart Ehrman, clearly says that they confirm Paul's letters, brother. And he's not the only one. Michael Heiser does well, and Bart Ehrman does as well. Let me get that off the screen. So we do have people who confirm that Paul's letters are authentic. Many PhD scholars do. Many do. But let's get back to the Esarhaddon Treaty and why the book of Deuteronomy is actually influenced, more than likely influenced the Esarhaddon treaties, right? And what people need to understand is that in the ancient Near East, right, is that they had many of these type of treaties that existed well before Deuteronomy 28, well before the Esarhaddon Treaty. We even have treaties that existed going far back with Hatshepsut, circa circa 14, circa 1550 to 1450 BCE. You know, so and her dealing and having vassal treaties with certain empires, right? Certain these Assyrian type empires at the time, right? Or what would later become Assyrian, right? But let's deal with it, right? So again, the victory stele of Esarhaddon is a Dolorite stele commemorating the return of Esarhaddon after his army's second battle and victory over Pharaoh Taharka. Now, we know Pharaoh Taharka was a real person. We also have in the biblical text a correspondence between King Hezekiah of the Bible entreating King Taharka for assistance and aid against Esarhaddon army, right? In northern ancient Egypt, 671, circa 671 BCE. This is why we can attest to the fact that Hezekiah was actually a real person. Because what we do have is a signet ring of King Hezekiah, or sometimes they call it a bulle, B-U-L-L-A, or a signet ring. And what it has on it is it has Aramaic writing at the time, or what took over for the Hebrew language, right? Because the Hebrew language was no longer in use by this time. And because of their Assyrian captivity, they had began to speak. The Israelite people of Israelite and Judah began to speak Aramaic, right? And so, but we have the bulle, we have the signet of King Hezekiah bearing his name, along with the signet of King Taharka. And most people will say, "Well, look at that. See, it has an Egyptian B on there and an Ankh on there, and why?" So these Israelites they had to be Egyptians. No, that's not what that means. What that means is that Israel, at the time that Hezekiah was ruling, became a vassal state. They were a vassal state to Pharaoh Taharka. This is why they entreated him for his help against these Esarhaddon and those in his army. And so this is why you actually see that ring there. And we know that King Hezekiah actually indeed was a real person, and he actually ruled a real kingdom, right? I was on Chris Harris' show earlier today, and they were talking about, he brings up Finkelstein quite a bit. He talks about how Finkelstein makes the argument that the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of David, his monarchy was not that big, right? It was very small, not much of it was found, and found none at all. Actually, it was free. But we know this not to be the case, and this is the reason why uh, Finkelstein fails, especially in the book Bible Unearthed, when he talks about King David's expansive King David's kingdom. We see that King David is attributed to having about, I think the number, I should be holding this information, but we see that we see evidence of his kingdom with King Hezekiah. We do see the evidence there. I just put it that way, right? Because that's for a different lesson, different time, right? And so we understand that these are not people who are made up. So when people talk about comic books and comic strips, right? We're talking about real people, real occurrences, things that really happen. It's not historical fiction, Shaka, almost. Right? So the Victory Stele of Esarhaddon, it was discovered in 1888 in Zencerkli, Oyuk, by Felix von Lucian Robert the Wake, right? And that's in the Uruk area in the ancient Near East where this was discovered, right? And so now we want to get into the real information, right? This is University. She wrote this article for the University of Oxford. This is Associate Professor of Hebrew of the Hebrew Bible and Old Testament Studies. Her name is Professor Laura Quick. Laura Quick. Again, Professor Laura Quick, right? And you guys can go and look at her her information, right? Check her out, vet her, see if she's worth this presentation, this argument, as a person to give accurate information. Right? Her name is Professor Laura Quick. Continue. Right? Professor Laura Quick, also assistant professor of religion and Judaic studies, Princeton University, March 2018. Right? She talks about curses in the book of Deuteronomy and in old Aramaic inscriptions. Right? I'm going to leave this up on the screen because what I want for you guys to do is see this information. And that's why I do my debates like this. This is why I do my lessons like this. So you can follow the sources that I'm saying and you can go and read for yourselves, right? Note this information over here, right? Just read what it says. Read it for yourself, right? So she writes about the curses in the book of Deuteronomy and in old Aramaic inscriptions, right? And the reason why I'm doing this lessons is because, again, that this information artist himself, Garfield Reed, says the book of Deuteronomy was taken from the Esarhaddon treaties. This is the claim that he made on HOK. This is the claim that he made, and he's made it more than once. So now it's time for me to put up the information so we can squash the disinformation campaign before it gets so somebody else can try to remember. Okay. So let's deal with it. Talk about what she said. Let's see what she said. Curses in the book of Deuteronomy and in old Aramaic inscription. Professor Quick gives key elements for why the succession treaties of Esarhaddon or Esarhaddon cannot be a direct literary device for Deuteronomy chapter 28. But the reverse is clearly what Garfield Reed was saying. That Deuteronomy chapter 28 was taken from the succession treaties of Esarhaddon. But Professor Laura Quick Oxford University contributor, Harvard University contributor, professor in religious studies, says the succession treaties of Esarhaddon cannot be a direct literary device for Deuteronomy chapter 28. And here's why. And you'll see this once you read her article, right? Her review. It says, her peer review article for that matter, right? It says the succession treaties of Esarhaddon, or with EST for short, has been suggested by some scholars to provide direct parallels with some of the curses found in Deuteronomy chapter 28. Weinfeld did this in 1965. Frankina did this in 1965. They actually wrote that article together. Levinson and Stacker come back and revises and reiterates, I should say, what Weinstein and Frankina says in 1965. Levinson and Stacker give no new information. They give no new information in this 2012 collaboration. They give no new information. They only repeat what Weinfeld and Frankina says in 1965. But let's talk about why this is false, right? Esarhaddon was the third king of the Sargonid dynasty, right? Or the period, or King Sargon, right? Of the Sargonid dynasty of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, right? And the succession treaties are the formal record of a treaty concerning the royal succession of Esarhaddon's chosen heir, his son Esarhaddon, which we know was a real person, right? Mentioned in the Bible, right? In Assyria, written in 672 BCE. Many scholars have been wary to posit a direct literary relationship between the succession treaties and the book of Deuteronomy. Why? Usually due to their reticence to attribute the kind of Akkadian literacy, which is what the succession treaties of Esarhaddon is considered part of, Akkadian literacy, that this would necessitate to the Hebrew scribes who wrote the biblical text. Morrow 2005 and Crouch 2014. There's your sources, people, that tell you why the succession treaties of Esarhaddon cannot be a direct literary device for Deuteronomy chapter 28, which is the reverse of what Garfield can't read posits. We can't keep allowing them to put this disinformation out here and then run away off into their little corners where they go, turn their face in the wall so you can't recognize them. They throw rocks and stones at windows and then run off like little boys. We have to make them accountable for the information. So when we hear these things, and the only reason why he even brings this up is even worth studying for him, is simply to say, see, Deuteronomy chapter 28, you Hebrews can't stand on that because you're faking, you're phony. You Israelites, you're faking, you're phony. You can't even stand on Deuteronomy chapter 28. You can't identify with any of that. Throw it out. Get rid of it because it's taken from the Esarhaddon treaties. Well, hold on, Jim Shoe. Hold on. Prove what you're saying. Prove what you're saying. And do what I just did. I gave you sources for the pro argument and sources for the con argument. And that's another thing, how these guys try to manipulate you. They only give you sources based on the information that agrees with their disinformation or seemingly agrees with their disinformation. That's another red flag. That's another identifier for people who are trying to manipulate you. They hate for you to try to look into this information and make a determination for yourself. So they'll only give you one-sided arguments. I never forget, Anonymous Hebrew and I and Orthodox Moore were on the Dagger Squad, and we were talking about genetics and how you could use genetics to a degree to support the biblical narrative and to support those who are from the Israelite diaspora. And he was trying to discredit Anonymous Hebrew based on the fact that you can't, nobody, there's no genetic evidence that you can show or household group that you can show that's older than what I'm showing you, brothers. You guys are disingenuous, and so when Anonymous Hebrew said, "Hey, look, here's my evidence, and let me show you my genetic breakdown," and when he showed that Anonymous Hebrew's genetic household group in his family tree goes back older than what Garfield Reed was saying. And mind you, Ngozi was on the panel as well. And Ngozi had to take a step back and say, well, you know what? Hey, the brother is right on that. I agree with him on that, Garfield. Garfield immediately says, you can't tell them that they're right, Ngozi. You can't tell them that. You can't tell them the truth, because if you tell them the truth, then they'll have an argument against our disinformation campaign. It's a true story. It's a fact. This is what I mean about these guys who simply look to deceive and manipulate through disinformation. They'll hold back, they'll lie, they'll manipulate information to win a poor argument. And see, this is what I'm talking about. What's being influenced, right? We got a brother saying, look, stop lying because these almost are word for word. No, it is not. It's exactly what I'm saying. You got that from a panel that you never even studied that from. It's not word for word. See, word for word would mean that it was copied. Mirror for mirror to mirror. It's copied. There's no one that's going to tell you, you're not going to find a scholar that says Deuteronomy 28 was copied from the Esarhaddon Treaty. That's why I say these. You have to learn how to argue these things when people talk about, oh, see, look, it says it word for word. No, it doesn't. And if it doesn't say word for word, if it's not translatable word for word, then you don't have an argument for a copy. Now you have to move into plagiarism. Now you have to say who plagiarized the text. Now you're really dead. This is what I mean about people who have no understanding how to disseminate this information correctly, especially when you're not parroting. Not parroting information here. So again, it says many scholars have been wary to posit a direct literary relationship between the succession treaties and the book of Deuteronomy, usually due to their reticence to attribute the kind of Akkadian literacy that this would necessitate to the Hebrew scribes who wrote the biblical text. I didn't write this. I didn't make it up. Don't tell me to stop it. If he's still living, you go write tomorrow about his 2005 work and crouch on his 2014 work, whom I am agreeing with. Go write to those scholars and tell them why they should stop it. This is what I mean, and I brought this out the other day. It's a prime example of people who are psychologically damaged with disinformation, that even if you show them the correct information, they still will resist it. They still will resist it. No matter how much you show them that what they've previously learned was false, no matter how much you tell them, no matter how much evidence, how much proof you show them, that still will say, you know what? I still don't believe it. So don't tell me to stop it. Go talk to Laura Quick, Professor Laura Quick. Go talk to Morrow. Go talk to Crouch. They say that it's no Akkadian literacy that would necessitate to the Hebrew scribes for them to even plagiarize or copy the Esarhaddon Treaty. Wholly implausible. Let's continue. Now I'm reading from the work of a peer-reviewed article of Dr. Laura Quick, and I'll go back and show it to you. The past few decades have brought to light additional inscriptions that also provide parallel phenomena to the curses in Deuteronomy chapter 28. Unlike the Esarhaddon Treaty, these inscriptions are written in Old Aramaic, a Northwest Semitic language utilized in Syria during the first millennium BCE. Thus, these inscriptions are both geographically and linguistically closer to the biblical world than the Mesopotamian texts, which scholars have previously referred to Deuteronomy 28, and they're talking about the Esarhaddon treaties. Come on, family. This is what I'm saying. This is what I'm talking about here. Like there's more ample evidence. These different types of treaties in the ancient Near Eastern culture were written all the time. And they date well back before the time of Esarhaddon. There are many inscriptions written in Old Aramaic, which would be more closer to the language spoken by the Hebrew. As we know later on, even all the way down through the Assyrian captivity, even all the way down through the time of Yahushua, he himself spoke a dialect of Aramaic. It's in the New Testament. They spoke Aramaic. Aramaic is quoted there. People talk about, oh no, the book is Greek. Why are the Greeks writing in Aramaic? It's utterly ridiculous, these arguments these guys try to place as if it has some substance. I want to go back and show everybody this article. It's called Curses in the Book of Deuteronomy in the Old Aramaic Inscription, right? And here it is by Laura Quick, Assistant Professor of Religion and Judaic Studies, Princeton University, March 2018. So we have a professor of religion and Judaic studies writing a peer-reviewed article from Princeton University in March 2018 that's also published in the University of Oxford. And this is not an appeal to authority, but what I'm telling you is when you're listening to disinformation campaigns come from people like Garfield Reed, who will tell you that the Deuteronomy 28 is taken from the Esarhaddon treaties. That's a disinformation campaign because we clearly see that there is newer, up-to-date information than what he would have gleaned from an argument that would have agreed with him in 1965. That now we have professors and writers and scholars writing in modern times that's showing us the evidence that it's not true. Let's continue. Lord Crick also writes this, right? Deuteronomy chapter 28 in the Aramaic Curse Tradition by Laura Quick. This is the actual cover of the book. It's Oxford Theology and Religions monograph, right? Deuteronomy chapter 28 Deuteronomy 28 in the Aramaic curse tradition. Tradition, right? By Lord Quick. And this is the link here. Anybody wants to go read it, y'all can pull it out and look at it. Pull it up and look at it. Read it for yourself. Let's see what the scholars actually say. Modern day. What they're actually talking about. I'm going to leave that here for you. Just in case. Some of you actually want to take notes. All right, let's continue. That's chapter 1 of the book. The same book in chapter 2, she gives the comparative method in scripture and in scripture, right? Lord Quick, the comparative method in scripture and in scripture, Deuteronomy chapter 28 in the Aramaic curse tradition, right? She also gives her her comparative methodology, comparing the scripture and the other Akkadian inscriptions, right? Or the Aramaic inscription. She does a comparative study that goes against what many would try to claim, that these things were copied word for word. No. Not even almost word for word. No. Don't even try to change it. Not in certain places. No. My wife just sent me earlier today. She sent me a text talking about different things that Black folks are prone to say. And it's about 20 things the lady rambled off, like the home industry types come on, and how we talk about see a child outside with no jacket on in the pool. How they child ain't got no jacket on? All Black mothers talk about that. You can't be home like come on. I brought you into this world and I take you out. That type of stuff. Now, the lady that was running off this list of things, I've never seen her and met her a day in my life. Don't know what her family background is. Don't know what her family tree looks like. Don't know the name of her children. Don't even know her name. But why is it that I can relate to what she was saying? Why is it that the things that went on in her household, things that her mother told her, were the same things I heard my mom say? And I'm sure as many of you heard your mom say some of those same things. And you don't know me from the man in the moon. I don't know this lady. But why are our moms saying the same things? I'm sure our mothers don't even know each other. But why are we saying the same things? Is her mom plagiarizing from my mom? Is my mom copying from her mom? Is your mother copying from this young lady I saw on TikTok? Why is she saying she grew up hearing the same things in her household? And I'm going to say she's plagiarizing? Her mother was plagiarizing? No. What are we talking about? Things that happen culturally. Things that happen to us in our environment that we react and respond the same way. If you're involved in the flood on the West Coast, and you're involved in the flood down South Mississippi, we might share some of the same experiences, but in a different culture. But in my culture, because I'm from the West Coast, I'm going to talk about my environment and my surroundings and how a flood affected us. But you're going to talk about how a flood affected you in your environment down south. And I guarantee you, some of the things that we both say, even though they happen in two separate places at two separate times with two different people, probably with two different vernaculars, Because people on the West Coast have sometimes now they have that valley talking. People down south, they have that southern drawl. So we ain't even saying some of the same, pronouncing some of the same words the same way. But how's it that I guarantee you we're going to come up with some of the same experiences, especially if we wrote them down? Am I going to say they plagiarized from us or we plagiarized from them? It's a very poor argument that these guys make all the time when they're talking about plagiarism and copying and somebody stole from this and somebody stole from that. It's a ridiculous argument. Stop allowing them to have and make these poor arguments as if they are speaking some type of factual evidence and information. Again, I showed in my previous series on the tensions of instructions of a Menahope versus Proverbs chapters 22, 23, and 24. When you start lining up these verses of what they're saying is copied, they're not even mirrored. They're not copied at all. But they're talking about things that are common from a father to a son. You can't even line them up side by side, verse by verse, and line them up and say, see, verse 1 in the instructions of Menahope, it says the exact same thing verse 1 says in Proverbs 22. It doesn't even work like that. You can't even do it. But I showed where the gentleman actually began this argument. It started with Eat Wallace Budge, but actually someone tried to pick up on it, and what they did was they had to change the narrative to change the language. Because the older biblical texts don't even say what the modern day text says. And they all hinging on this 30 sayings. The older works says excellent sayings in the verse. The modern day, some of the modern day translations say 30. Some say 3. But the cadence is different. The structure, the arrangement, it's nothing alike. But people take these arguments, these poor arguments, and they run with them as if they're fact. And this is trash scholarship, a lot of disinformation that floats around from these different platforms. So again, in Deuteronomy chapter 28 in the Aramaic curse tradition by Laura Quick, she talks about the Aramaic curse tradition. Chapter 2, she talks about the comparative methods she uses in regards to both the scripture and the instruction, the Aramaic instruction. Chapter 3, she talks about the futility curse as a Northwest Semitic trope, the old Aramaic inscription. And I have the links here. I'm just afraid that if I do that, she really breaks it down. But let's go here. The Fall and Rise of Covenant, Law and Treaty, Kenneth A. Kitchen, right? Let's see if I can pull this one up. Here we go. Here we go. The Fall and Rise of Covenant Law and Treaty. And we're talking about why Garfield can't read, is wrong about his statement made on the HOK that Deuteronomy chapter 28 is taken from the Esarhaddon treaties. Why he's wholly wrong, right? But this is part of the disinformation campaign. But this is a good article to read. It's called The Fall and Rise of Covenant Law and Treaty, Kenneth A. Kitchen, right? The theme of, I'll just read the abstract. The theme of covenant, and especially the Sinai covenant and its renewals, have attracted much debate for over a century in Old Testament studies. In a recent book, succinctly and clearly written and handsomely presented, Professor E.W. Nicholson has reviewed the vicissitudes of covenant in Old Testament studies. In effect, from Wellhausen, and if you don't really know who Wellhausen is, Wellhausen, he's the one that comes up with this. He doesn't create it, but he furthers it. He makes it popular, this whole documentary hypothesis, right? Where they talk about the J source, the E source, right? That Wellhausen, that's who this guy is, right? To the present decade. The thrust of his book is that Old Testament studies have come full circle. Wellhausen originally denied the covenant, both term and concept, any effective existence until the 8th, in particular the 7th centuries BC. And now, after varied peregrinations, not a few contemporary Old Testament scholars, including Nicholson, wish to return to that position. As chapter 1 makes clear, Wellhausen's view divided opinions sharply for some 40 years. They argued over this. Such scholars as Stade, Meyer, Gunkel followed Wellhausen and denying the antiquity of the Sinai covenant. And that's why guys like Garfield Reed and even Chris Harris often like to try to place the biblical text along with the pseudo-science that I call Russell Gummerkin, one of the pseudo-science. He's a fringe theorist, right? He tries to place it. Who's actually one of the master teachers of the Dagger Squad, based on that, based on what they said, not what I say. They said that, right? Russell Gummerkin was one of them master teachers, right? That they tried to place the biblical narrative circa 700 BCE and earlier, right? I mean, and later, and later, right? Always, sometimes down to the 4th century BCE when the Bible was written, right? They try to make this argument, but I want people to know this is not a new argument that they're making. But what I want y'all to see is here where all of that argument has already been debunked on the antiquity of the scriptures, right? It says, especially the Torah, it says, as chapter 1 makes clear, Wellhausen's view divided opinions sharply for some 40 years. He was one of those people that wanted to place the biblical narrative circa 700 to 800, what he says. Originally denied the covenant and concept until the 8th, in particular 7th centuries BCE. So when these guys are up here on these platforms and they say, no, you don't even get a Bible, you don't even get this, you don't even get the Deuteronistic, if I'm saying it correctly, text until the 700 century BC, the 700 BCE, 7th century BCE. Well, nah, stop that. That's an old argument that even telling you right here that has been debunked. It's trash, right? Wellhausen is denying the antiquity of the Sinai covenant, right? And what do we know about the book of Deuteronomy? It's only repeating. It's repeating most of what we read in Exodus. It's repeating that covenant. It's a repeat, right? And so it says others such as Hittel, Sturgeon, Prosk, and Gressman all argued in varying degree for a covenant enacted in some form at Sinai under Moses. So when they tell you no scholar ever thought Moses was a real person and like, come on, bro, stop all that. We know better than that. And anybody that does say, any PhD scholar that does say Moses was a real person, they try to discredit him. like Titus Kennedy, right? Or Douglas Petrovich, right? We know there are PhD scholars that actually say Moses was a real person. Stop playing games with us. You see what I'm saying? So this is what I mean. I'm going to address you, Sakura, because you really don't understand what you're talking about. When it comes to, let me tell you this, right? When folks talk about, then we should read. If you're an Israelite, then you should read everything in Hebrew, right? Well, you should only speak the Hebrew text, so you can't be an Israelite if you don't speak the language. You can't even speak the language. That's another argument that you try to throw at us. And then I'm going to get back to this lesson. If you read Isaiah chapter, I believe it's Isaiah chapter 28 in verse 11, it tells you that we would receive the knowledge from the Most High, the book of the law. We receive everything, every teaching we need, we would get in the language that we would get in the language that we speak, even if it is of the language of our captors. That the information still would be disseminated to us. And so that's what you see. So does it make you a stronger studier or an understanding more so of certain things that what the English is trying to say? If you understood the old Hebrew language in Aramaic, does it make you for a stronger study? Yes. But there's reference books and textbooks that's already broken this information down. We don't even have to rely on the King James Version Bible, because I do agree there are many errors in it. But the errors are not to the point where it takes away from the context. But what it does is it gives you studying outside of the King James Version and using other versions, right, that are more older and clear in some versions, like the Syriac or the Peshitta or something like that. These texts also should likely help you. Let me drink something. Help you to understand even more of things that are going on. So no, I don't just study the King James Version Bible, right? So we don't necessarily always have to look at the original language. That makes absolutely no sense. Makes absolutely no sense. We don't have to speak the original language in order to identify with Israel. That's another poor argument that they make. Why we need to study the Hebrew and why we need to study Aramaic and different languages, we need to study as many languages as we can, because Israel itself was a mixed multitude, and we see loan words coming in from all different types of cultures, back and forth, back migration, sharing, and trade. We see this all the time, right? We know that even the Zionists, they speak Yiddish. That's just a German dialect. That's the last people we want to copy. It's those Yiddish Israelis. Those are the last people we want to copy. But let me get back into it. It says, all argued the covenant enacted some form at Sinai under Moses. The term beret for covenant was discussed at length with varying results. J. Pedersen, 1914, invoked in non-biblical data, but utilized only the impossible late pre-Islamic Arabian sources. And Arabic is another solid source language to understand some of the things that we're talking about in these scriptures. So we need to learn more than just one language, right? Some things we can only stand because they still exist in the Arabic language. Pre-Islamic Arabian sources refusing to consider data from ancient Mesopotamia on the inadequate ground that is supposedly urban civilization led to different significance to the term there. So by 1920, no agreed solution had emerged. And see, this is what I mean about when Garfield always talk about you have to have a consensus. You know, when he talks about a consensus of scholars, right? A consensus of scholars, right? Well, to have an argument, and before you can even claim a consensus of scholars, they have to do what you just read right here. All of these scholars have to get together and come to a determination on both the pro and con side to say either we agree to disagree, or we're going to shelve this, or overwhelmingly evidence has been presented in this meeting of the minds that this is what we're going to go with, right? But here it says, even on the covenants and the existence of Moses and the Sinai and the dating of the Sinai covenants and treaties, it says, so by 1920, no scholar, that's what it's talking about, no agreed solution had emerged. They all didn't agree for years. Years. They didn't agree. So you know what they did? You know what they did? We agree to disagree. But no one can claim which one was right and which one was wrong, Garfield. Unless there's a meeting of the minds that's recorded, you can't make those claims. This is what I mean about disinformation. Disinformation. Let's continue. Just a little bit here. But in the ensuing 30 years, 1920 to 1950, the controversy ended. To reuse the title of chapter 2 from the mid-20s, more and more scholars accepted both the antiquity and significance of covenant in early Israel, arguing in its favor under fresh impulses. That's what I wanted to show you, family. Let me get back to the Let me get back to the presentation. Share my screen again. There. And that's the information that we get from the fall and rise of covenant law and treaty, Kenneth A. Kitchen. So to answer some of the questions in the chat, no. We've already established that the book of Deuteronomy is way older and established its place in antiquity than that of Esarhaddon or the Esarhaddon treaty. So clearly, the book of Deuteronomy is established well before the Esarhaddon treaties. That's clear. So the Esarhaddon treaties could not have influenced Deuteronomy chapter 28. Now let me break it down for you even further. Dating Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy claims to be an authoritative instruction about Israel's conduct in the land. However, it appears to be unknown at many points in Israel history, even unfamiliar to the prophets. It only comes to prominence in Israel history in Josiah's reign in 622 BCE. That's part of the argument. When a book of the law is discovered in the temple, the subsequent reform describes 2 Kings 22 to 23 has a number of similarities with Deuteronomy's teaching. In 1805, William M.L. DeWitt famously suggested that Deuteronomy was not rediscovered, but written in order to be discovered. In other words, Deuteronomy or something like it originated in the 7th century BCE. So those is part of the arguments against why people like to make these arguments that the Esarhaddon Treaty influenced the book of Deuteronomy, right? But we just showed in Kenneth Kitchen's work in his review that that's impossible, right? So let's continue. And this is what I mean about showing both pros and cons of an argument, right? Talked about this earlier, right? So we can get both sides a well-rounded understanding of why things are, right? Of why things are. It says, the majority of critical scholars hold that the first version of Deuteronomy originated in the 7th century. Now remember, now here's the key, right? And the reason why I put this in here, because I wanted people to understand this. What does this say? The majority of critical scholars. And when it's talking about critical scholars, it says those, not those are just those who simply just critiquing, but those who are opposed to certain ideas. They're critical of the idea of an ancient, of an older Sinai covenant that could have been written or was written by Moses, right? They're critical of the narrative that Deuteronomy gives. They're critical of it, right? So it says advocates, right? It says, but there are some who have argued that the book comes from the exilic or early post-exilic period, right? Advocates of this latter dating often point to the subdued role of the monarchy in Deuteronomy. There have also always been conservative scholars who advocate an earlier date, such as in the time of the judges. Whenever the first edition of Deuteronomy was written, many scholars hold that the book was subsequently edited and expanded. Interpreting Deuteronomy. A central idea in Deuteronomy is covenant, the relationship of loyalty between God and Israel. There is no agreement on whether this important metaphor originated with Deuteronomy, but the idea is certainly worked out in detail in Deuteronomy. From here, it has influenced many other parts of the Old Testament. The idea of covenant is derived from the world of diplomacy and international relations. Indeed, we could translate covenant as treaty, and Deuteronomy shows many similarities with ancient treaties, especially those known from 7th century BCE Assyria. How did it happen that a treaty between a foreign potentate and subject nations was taken over with God as the main treaty partner? Is the book of Deuteronomy to be viewed as a subversion of Assyrian treaties, such that loyalty is to be shown to Israel's God rather than the Assyrian overlord? Right? So that's the argument that people try to have with this, right? Let me see if I'm gonna get. I don't think I can get that source up right there. I think. Oh yeah, I do got it right here. Right, Deuteronomy chapter 28, 58. And we're talking about the rhetoric self-reference. Let's get into it. This source revisits the long perceived referential difficulty in the phrases this sefer in Deuteronomy 28 to 58. And see, this is the key right here, right? This is the key argument for the reason why. This is the key argument, right? This is a smoking gun for me, right? One of many, but this is one of these smoking guns for me. When you want to argue that Deuteronomy chapter 28 was taken from the Esarhaddon treaty, this is clearly evidence as to why it's wholly inaccurate. Wholly inaccurate, right? So pay attention, family. This source revisits the long perceived referential difficulty in the phrase this sefer in Deuteronomy chapter 28 and 58. It introduces phraseology, watch this, drawn from the 14th century BCE Hittite treaty of Sepulima, the first, with Piti of Nuhashi, right? Parallel to the expression, all the words of this sefer written in this Torah, right? Deuteronomy chapter 28 and 58. In light of this comparative evidence, it argues that it is probable that this sefer had a self-referential function. The expression this sefer in Deuteronomy chapter 28, 58 indicates for audiences that the material text object on which the verse was written, and does not merely point to a text object that exists within the world of the narrative. Finally, it considers the analogy of treaty performance to understand how the spatial relationship created between audiences and physical text objects through Docetic self-reference functions within the literary context of the Deuteronomic source. Well before, watch this, well before the 8th century BCE Hittite phraseology is seen in Deuteronomy 28. What phraseology is that? This term right here in Deuteronomy chapter 28, 58. This sefer, right? Or seper, right? is seen in Deuteronomy 28:58. This shows the possibility of Deuteronomy being more likely written where? In the 14th century BCE, at the time of the Exodus, according to many scholars, circa 1446 to 1447 BCE. You're dead. You're dead. This is what I mean about challenging these guys and showing them that if they actually study the text and not just read some French theorists or French scholars or pseudo-scientific scholars take on the scriptures to try to fit it into their paradigm, why they're critical of the Bible itself or the Torah itself, or them being critical of Hebrew Israelites themselves, like Garfield Reed just simply wants to discredit Hebrew Israelites. That's why I call him Garfield Can't Read, because if he actually read Deuteronomy chapter 28:58 and actually studied, he would have come across in Deuteronomy chapter 28:58 this term, this sefer or this sefer, and understand that that is a term that dates back to 1446 BCE, 1450 BCE, to the time of the Exodus. That many scholars like Titus Kennedy and Douglas Petrovich actually date the Exodus, and many others. Not during the time of the Esarhaddon Treaty. We're talking about 700 years, circa 700 years before the Esarhaddon, the Esarhaddon Treaty is written. This is what I'm talking about. They can't make these arguments in earnest, family. They can't do it. They can't do it. And they constantly continue to try to discredit the Bible, try to discredit the Torah, try to tell you why it's inaccurate, try to tell you why we should throw away Deuteronomy chapter 28 and 58. Nah, we don't got to do that. Not based on your argument, buddy. Not you coming with the disinformation saying that it was taken from the Esarhaddon Treaty. Nope, no can do. Can't do it. Can't do it. Can't do it. Yeah, absolutely. See, this is what this is what I'm saying. You should go and study Queen Hatshepsut and the people that she was dealing with at the time, and the treaties that she was making at the time. We see one of the first references of the Habesha people, of the Habesha people, of the Habesha people being contacted by Queen Hatshepsut. Queen Hatshepsut dealt with many people all over the ancient Near East. And Queen Hatshepsut, during her reign, is the time that me personally, along with PhD scholars like Titus Kennedy and Douglas Petrovich, placed the time of the Exodus. And Moses, absolutely. Absolutely. Go study the Battle of Kadesh. Go study the Battle of Kadesh and see who were the Egyptians and see who the Egyptians were fighting against. Go study it. Is it Kadesh or Kamish? One of the two, Kadesh or Kamish. Go study. I keep telling people, I was telling them earlier over on Chris Harris' channel, that there were two distinct groups of Hittites. There was an older Hittite, and then there was a group that came in that acculturated the older Hittite kingdoms and began to call themselves Hittites. But they weren't biologically, and they weren't native to native Hittites. But they acculturated them and began to call themselves Hittite. And most of the times when you guys are studying information, you're only talking about the latter Hittites, not the earlier ones. That's why you're confused. But Yahweh is not the author of confusion. Right? But again, Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 58, it uses a phrase, a Hittite phrase from the 14th century BCE. It uses a Hittite phrase. And that phraseology is the seper or seper, right? And it introduces phraseology drawn from the 14th century BCE Hittite treaty of Supelima, right? With Titi of Nuhesi. And if I'm not mistaken, that Nuhesi, when they say this term right here, Nuhesi, right here, I believe that's Nubia. That's a reference to Nubia. So we know these people were dealing with each other. That's why I laugh when people talk about what was taken and stolen and what was copied. That's ridiculous. And these people were dealing with each other daily. We even have attestations of ancient Kemet that had treaties with ancient Near Eastern cultures that if slaves ran away from ancient Kemet and would go to these foreign lands to hide or start a new life or to hide out, that those treaties that they had with those ancient Near Eastern cultures, that they had to return those slaves back to ancient Kemet. So I laugh at a lot of you guys. And I sent Sister Natalie, Natalie, shout out to you, sister, in the chat. And this is why I said she destroyed Shaka Amos. And she and Jababel in that debate, especially when she was talking about Hathor. Like, either they can't read or they're pathological life. Because she clearly showed them the evidence, and what they tried to do was take her off of some whole other topic she didn't even come talking about. And they never even answered her question. Like, these people are jokes. But this is the gun right here. I'm going to read it again. Well before the 8th century BCE Hittite phraseology is seen in Deuteronomy chapter 28:58. This shows the possibility of Deuteronomy 28 being more likely written in the 14th century BCE at the time of the Exodus, according to many scholars, 1446 to 1447. Again, let me show you the period. That's the M 2020. 2020. M Lester 2020. Now let's look at that. Lester deserves credit for drawing our attention to a specific parallel from the 14th century BCE Hittite treaty of Supelima, the first with Titi of Nuhesi, which he shows to exhibit close verbal and functional parallels to Deuteronomy 28:58. A Middle Babylonian copy of the treaty preserves a self-referential statement in the concluding curse and blessing section. Menume awati sa riski u sa mamiti ina libi tupi aniti satrat, which means all the words of the bond and the oath that are written in this tablet. Indeed, when analyzed side by side, Deuteronomy chapter 28:58, as Lester argues, the two texts have strikingly similarities in syntax, semantics, and form. Lester denies any direct literary dependence between them. Even though they show some similarities in syntax, semantics, and form, he still denies any direct literary dependence between them. Why? Because he knows what he's talking about, but rather emphasizes a common use in the protasis of conditional statements at the beginning of a blessing or curse, and especially a shared self-referential function that accentuates the relationship between the text and the audience in the framework of a formal treaty agreement. Source: Deuteronomy's book and Hammurabi Stele, the referent of the Sefer in Deuteronomy chapter 28:58, by Bill T. Arnold, Ashbury Theological Seminary, Wilmore, Kentucky, USA. And if some of you geniuses want to reach out to him, here's his email address right here: bill.arnold@ashburyseminary.edu. And here he shows Deuteronomy chapter 28 and section 53 of the Superliminal First treaty with Titi of New Hesse. Right? It says, all the words of this Torah that are written in this cipher. It says the words of the bond and the oath are written on this tablet. And see, that's why he doesn't make any direct literary dependence. You know why? Because it's not word for word. Same thing you have with the instructions of Amenehope in Proverbs 22:23. It's not word for word. It's not a copy. Doesn't mirror each other. Don't even matter what language you write it in. It does not say the same thing, but they do have similarities based on similar experiences. These sayings, these things that they even claim structures of Amenehope was plagiarized. The book of Proverbs, chapters 22, 23, and 24. These things are not even lined. You can't even line them up. You see, there's section 23. Both of these are proper 23. Both of these are proper 24. 20. It doesn't even work like that. You have to stop doing that. You have to stop doing that. And no, this is not saying. This is not saying. Let me read it for you again. This is not saying that Deuteronomy chapter 28 was influenced by the Hittite treaties. What they're saying is that what he says here, right? Indeed, when analyzed side by side, we see right here. Well, I put the example there so you can see it for yourself, right? When analyzed side by side with Deuteronomy 28:58, as Lester argues, the two texts have striking similarities in syntax, semantics, and form. Lester denies any direct literary dependence between them. That means you can't not Deuteronomy can't rest on the Hittite on the Hittite treaty, and the Hittite treaty can't rest on Deuteronomy. That's what he's telling you. That's what he's telling you. That's what he's telling you. So these are the things we have to get right, family. That's what he's telling you clearly here. I got the source right for you here. You can read the source right there in the bottom of the screen. It doesn't matter. So, but I hear what you're saying, but it doesn't matter if they have some of the same ones. It doesn't matter. The Esarhaddon Treaty doesn't date older than Deuteronomy chapter 28. Doesn't matter. It just doesn't. It just does not. Let's go back to y'all comic book analysis, right? Let's go back to your comic book analysis. If you argue, can you really argue that the let's say what is it? DC Comics. Will anyone say that DC Comics is the same exact Marvel Comics? Which comic book came first? Is Marvel a plagiarism of DC Comics? Because they all have superheroes in it. The oldest, no, brother. The oldest existence of Deuteronomy is not in its season, but it's not. I just told you. Look up what they call the Silver Scroll. You see excerpts of verses of Deuteronomy in this computer. No, what I asked about the comic book was that which one is older? Which one is older? Simply because they have stories about comic book heroes doesn't mean that one's plagiarized the other. Because you have heroes with similar or like ability, right? That doesn't mean that one was copied from the other, or one was stolen, or one was plagiarized from the next. It's called the Silver Scroll. Yeah, they had the Silver Scrolls has excerpts of the books of Deuteronomy in there. Not in full, not in full, but they had excerpts from it, so we know that these books existed. These things were written; they were known about well before the Esarhaddon treaties. And here's another one. Here's one of my favorite sources right here. Because we're gonna try to shut this down at the top of the hour. Deuteronomy chapter 28 and tell Tayanet, Telinat, Niat, Yanat, Tayanat. That's how I say it, right? From 2013, original research. University of Pretoria, South Africa, the Department of Old Testament Studies by Hans U. Stemanzum II. All right, I know tel means mountain or mount or mound, right? So let's see what they say. Deuteronomy chapter 28:58 and tel Tayanet, right? Or the mountain or the mound at Tayanat. It says the treaty tablet from Tel Tayanat was displayed in antiquity in the temple's inner sanctum. It measures 40 centimeters by 26 centimeters, and like the Nimrod manuscripts, it must be rotated along its vertical axis in order to read the reverse. It is pierced through its horizontal axis so that it could be fixed by a stick that was pushed into the tablet's hole and hooked into a stand. The treaty partners are the anonymous governor, Bel Mahiti, right? And 16 anonymous individuals designated by occupation, and finally all inhabitants of the province subject to the governor. And that source is Lainger from 2012, pages 87 and pages 90. It says this find corroborates hypotheses about the influence of the Esarhaddon Treaty on Deuteronomy 28. It dismisses Laverne Rainier's claim that the Esarhaddon Treaty was only meant for Median bodyguards of the Assyrian court. It also dismisses the idea of an Aramaic translation. And that's huge right there. And so I know many people, right, when they start reading this information, that's why I say you got to read it carefully, right? It says it also dismisses the idea of an Aramaic translation of the Esarhaddon Treaty used for Western vassals of Assyria. That the Assyrian royal chancellery produced an official Aramaic translation of the ESP of the Esarhaddon Treaty is unlikely due to the sophisticated rhetoric effectiveness of the language used in the Assyrian text. Word repetitions and multitudes of 7 and 8 render the Esarhaddon treaty, a message appealing to God and man, a piece of art that only God's well-trained scribes can really appreciate. So do y'all understand what they're saying? It says that the Assyrian World Chancellery produced an official Aramaic translation of ESV is unlikely. What language were the Israelites speaking? What were the Hebrew scribes speaking at the time of Esarhaddon? Circa 671 BCE. They were speaking Aramaic. So if they're saying that the Assyrian world, if they're saying that the Assyrian royal chancellery produced an official Aramaic translation of the EST is unlikely due to the sophisticated rhetoric, effectiveness of the language used in the Assyrian text, then that means that no Hebrew scribe would have been able to read the Esarhaddon treaties and therefore would not have been able to copy it or plagiarize it to place it in the book of Deuteronomy. The scholars are saying there's no evidence, no suggestion of an Aramaic translation of the Esarhaddon treaty. That the Hebrews in their language would have been able to read or write, especially copy it. And that time is 2003. And here you see them digging on an archaeological project at Tel Tayanat through the University of Toronto, Neo-Hittites in the land of the Palestine. A renewed investigation at Tel Tayanat on the plain of Antioch near Eastern archaeology. This is the excavation of the tablet of the Esarhaddon's history in Temple 19 at Tel Tayanat. No, 16. Like 16 at Tel Tayanat. So that's a bomb right there. The head roll. Deuteronomy and the Hittite Treaty. Richard Jude Thompson, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, faculty member, PhD, is another PhD. Harvard University, Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, 2011. Professor of Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, and English, French, Spanish, and German at Hebrew University. Chapter 4, the Deuteronomistic covenant and Hittite treaties. Let's see what he says. Another PhD scholar for you. This is what I'm talking about when you start really talking about these disinformation campaigns. Listen to what he says. Deuteronomy and Hittite treaties, chapter 4. It says, because George E. Mendel proposed that the form of the covenant evident in the book of Deuteronomy derived from the Hittite Empire and its subjugation treaties, this study looks next at the Hittite Empire. Mendenhall argued that the treaties of Suppiluliuma I, Menardi II, and Mutawalli II, circa 1344 to 1271 BCE, resembled the covenant in the book of Deuteronomy. This study will review first the scholarship concerning Mendenhall's pro-job and other studies that relate to the DHS, that relates to DHS to the Hittites. In order to get behind the religious presumptions of the treaties, this study looks second at the religion of the Hittites. Third, in order to understand the presuppositions of imperialism were evident in the treaties. This study analyzes the annals and war reports. Fourth, in order to get a sense of the purpose and function of the Hittite subjugation treaties, this study looks at the treaties within a much wider scope than that analyzed by Mendenhall and others. The chapter finishes with a comparison of the Hittite ideological worldview and the Deuteronomistical covenant. And I just want to get down to this section right here. Right? It says, this present study finds that the arguments for the derivation of the treaty form of Deuteronomy from the treaties of the Hittites or from a common uh, ancient Near Eastern source rest on formal literacy grounds with little relation to history. It says studies that link the DH to international treaty forms illustrate one of the problems in Mendenhall's theory. They do not explain why a local Canaanite god would impose an international subjugation treaty on his own people rather than on the target population. In order to get a better sense of this possible relationship between the treaty ideology of the Hittite Empire and that of the DH, this study proposes to learn more about the religion, the warfare, and the function of the imperial treaty. What purpose did it serve? What presuppositions does it make about the nature of the god, the imperial agenda, the god's relationship with the subject, and the idea of legal conquest under the authority of God? They're saying there's no connection historically. There's no connection. There's no connection. So again, it says right here, McCarthy, I'm gonna go back up to the top, right? It says McCarthy, the buried covenant of Deuteronomy fits into the international treaties of the Levant and Canaanite Phoenician world of Jerusalem. The vocabulary of the Hittite treaty form might have borrowed its term for treaty rickshaw from the Assyrians. The Assyrians later borrowed the Aramaic term adi or adek to represent their imperial treaties. Weinfurt in 1965 finds that the international character of the Hittite covenant parallels to the international expressions of covenant in Deuteronomy. According to Brinkman, the Deuteronomic covenant fits into the genre of international treaty in a broad generic sense that includes dedente treaties between empires, subjugation treaties with the weaker countries, and eternal loyalty oaths. Deuteronomy may fit into the configuration worldwide in speech of the Hittite treaties from the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, according to Keel, the Hittite treaties with historical review, basic principles, specifications, and blessings and cursings appear to correspond to those of Deuteronomy. The covenant of loyalty of the Aramaic and Levantine states to the Assyrians, however, appear closer in time to the Deuteronomistic than do the Hittite treaties. And Keel views Deuteronomic passages, Deuteronomy 13 and 7 to 12 and 20 to 24, rather than the Aramaic Levantine treaties to the Assyrians, right? So again, there's no stance for that, right? And so let me do with this right here. Let me do with this right here. I'm gonna do this right here. Let me do it. Hold on 1 second. Hold on right here. I'm trying to find the source right here. I'm sorry, I got another presentation I'm looking for. Real quick. Real quick, family. Real quick. All right, here we go. Real quickly. Let me do this. Trying to find this one source right here. Trying to find this one source right here. Just bear with me. Give me a second. Come on. Where is it? I got it in my slides. I want to show you guys something else. Is this it right here? This may be it right here. Bear with me. Trying to find that right there. Here it is. Gotcha. This is what I wanted to do. Let me do it right here. Okay. This is what I wanted to bring out right here. Really quickly. I want to address that right here. First of all, we have to deal with people when they start talking about, and I'm getting ready to address Rockman from the Virgin Islands. I'm getting ready to address what you're talking about when I brought about the Silver Scrolls. The book of Deuteronomy is nothing but a retelling. And I said this earlier in the show. It's nothing but a retelling. I don't know what you're talking about, bro. It's nothing but a retelling of the book of Exodus. The argument is whether or not do we have evidence of the book of Deuteronomy being older Hold on. I'm going to show you something. I'm looking for something specific here. I'll show you something here real quick. Right. See, why would we be looking for books? Either it existed or it didn't exist. So here's the argument when you guys try to say, let me put up on the screen so people can see what we talking about right now. I want to address this right here. Let me deal with this real quick. Here we go. This is what I wanted to show. Let me share my screen real quick. I'm going to put a man's comment up on here right here. All right. Now watch this. I want to show you something. Let me share my screen. How you doing? There we go. Show my screen. There we go. Now, the brother's comment when I told him to go check out the Silver Scrolls, right? So the Silver Scrolls, he says, is a Numbers. He's referring to the book of Numbers, chapter 6, verses 24 through 26, which is a one-line fragment. He said, I made it up when I told the brother go check out the Silver Scrolls, right? Now, I got his verse up right here, right? Y'all can see it. This is number 6, chapters, verses 24 through 26. Now, we know the book of Numbers precedes the book of Deuteronomy, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, right? Watch this. I kept telling you the book of Deuteronomy only reiterates the previous books, right? It only reiterates what it reads in the previous books. So usually whatever you read in the book of Deuteronomy, you're going to find it existed already or stated already somewhere else in either Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Specifically, Exodus, Leviticus, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, right? That's neither here nor there. It's neither here nor there. Now, watch. I'm just dealing with what the brother Rockman posted because he thinks he got something right here, right? And I'm glad he specifically put up number 6 through 24 through 26 because when I told him to go to the Dead Sea Scrolls, he went to he went to the Silver Scrolls, and he looked at the exact verses, lines, or fragments. He said, "Oh, it's fragments. It's not even a book." Y'all got to start with their retarded argument, okay? Start with their retarded argument. It doesn't matter, right? It's from some. A fragment is a piece of something. not a whole, it's a piece of something. It's a piece of something, a piece of a scroll, a piece of a book, right? Which gives credence to there actually existed a scroll or a book in whole. Like, that's a silly argument. Well, let's deal with it, right? So he brought up Leviticus, he brought up Numbers 6 and 26. I'm sorry, he brought up number 6, verses 24 through 26, right? To try to debunk what I said, go back and check it out to substantiate the book of Deuteronomy. When I already said before, Deuteronomy only repeats what what's already been said. It's just a repeat. Now watch this. Why do we know it wasn't added later show? Why do we know that Numbers 6 and 26 and 24 and 26? Watch this. Watch this. Right? We read here in these 3 verses, the Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face to shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace. Right? And I don't expect you guys to be Bible scholars, but we as Bible scholars know that it's the same thing you read right here in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9. These same things. Hear, O Lord, the Lord our God is one, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy might. And these words which I command these days shall be in thy heart, and shall teach thee diligently unto their children, and all these things diligent unto their children, shall talk of them when thou sittest in thy house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, when thou risest up, and thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thy hand, and they shall be as frontlets between thine eyes, and thou shalt write them upon the posts of thy house on thy gates. Right? So why are these 2 verses linked? I'm gonna show y'all something. Right? Why are these 2 verses linked? Watch this. Because people always ask this question, are Numbers and Deuteronomy the same? Watch this. The book of Numbers and Deuteronomy narrate a number of the same stories. Deuteronomy 1, 2, 3 even covers the same narrative space as the book of Numbers, the 40 years or so from the Sinai to the plains of Moab. Let me see if I can pull this up on Brill. I don't know if I renewed my account with them or not. It says this article will examine the complex relationship between these 2 books by considering the narratives about the time in the wilderness. This will be addressed in the following clusters: narratives told in Numbers and Deuteronomy, narratives told in Numbers and alluded to in Deuteronomy, and narratives in Numbers that are not told in Deuteronomy. These will be examined in order to shed light on the individual books of Numbers and Deuteronomy, the relationship between them, the question of whether they were a Deuteronomic narrative that retold how Israel went from the desert to the edge of the promised land. I will argue that there is no evidence for a continuous narrative tracing Israel's journey from Sinai to Moab prior to the composition of Deuteronomy 123. The authors of the narratives and Numbers are indebted to this Deuteronomistic account. However, for the readers of the Pentateuch, Deuteronomy 3 appears as a concise summary of what has preceded, with the most important issues highlighted. And so basically, again, Deuteronomy is only a retelling of Numbers. And as I showed you in the previous course, that's why when we can go back and say, hey, look, let's look at what the Silver Scrolls is saying, right? And it brings us extras of the book of Numbers that we find in the book of Deuteronomy. It's the same text there. It's the same text there. So no, I didn't make it up. You just have to study more. You have to study more. So none of it's made up. It's the same thing. So again, let me go back here and let me show the brother. He just asked a question. He asked a question. When was it retold? Now I'm going to show you immediately right here. What does this say right here? I showed this source earlier. Hope y'all can see it. It says, based on this phraseology, this cipher, in Deuteronomy 28:58, it introduces phraseology drawn for the 14th century BCE. So we know that the book of Deuteronomy, based on the wording itself, dates back to what we see in other treaties during this time, 14th century BCE, well before the 8th century BCE Hittite phraseology is seen in Deuteronomy 28:58. This shows the possibility of Deuteronomy being more likely written in the 14th century BCE at the time of the Exodus, according to many scholars, dates the Exodus 1446 to 1447 BCE. And here is your source for that, M. Lester 2020. So whatever it was told or retold, we know that it dates back to the 14th century BCE, to the time of the Exodus by many scholars, to the time of Queen Hatshepsut. Now, that's not a rebuttal saying no, it don't. You got to argue with the scholars. Argue with M. Lester. Send him an email, reach out to him and see what he says. That's not an assumption. This phraseology didn't exist. It existed well before the 8th century BCE. But it's not being used in the Esarhaddon Treaty. But it's being used in Deuteronomy 28. So it couldn't have come from the Esarhaddon Treaty. That's the whole point. They're using language in Deuteronomy much older than Esarhaddon treaties. Much older. That's the point. That's not an assumption. That's a fact. That's a fact. And saying no, it don't is not even a rebuttal. Saying that's an assumption is not a rebuttal. You have to submit and source evidence that says the contrary. That says the contrary. It was not written later. It says right here, can you read? It says Deuteronomy being more likely written in the 14th century BCE at the time of the Exodus. Why you keep saying later? Where's your evidence of that? You have no evidence of that. The wording itself in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 28, 68, chapter 28 and 58, clearly says that. Clearly tells us when it was written. You can't really make that argument, brothers. See, this is what I'm saying. Y'all got to do better than that. Y'all not really ready for these arguments. You're not really ready for these arguments. It's not, based on the wording, based on the phraseology. Yes, based on the phraseology. Yes, it's called a comparative linguistics. That's what I told you right here in the opening. A cultural and linguistic comparative analysis. Yes, absolutely. This is how you date documents. This is how you date literature to determine when it was written, how it was written, and who wrote it. Y'all like to deal with science when it suits you, but you don't like to deal with all science. The study of linguistics is a science, brother. And I just showed you a methodology. Like, no, it could not have. No, not based on not based on the linguistic comparative analysis. No, it could not have been. No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Anything else you read outside of that, brother, that's theory. No, absolutely not. It could not have been. The evidence doesn't support that. Evidence doesn't support it. Simple as that. So again, man, it's been a good show, man. I hope you guys learned something, man. I'm not averse to having people disagree with me. I think respectful disagreement is always needed. You have a fragment, bro. Like most of the ancient papyrus that you find, bro, and most of anything written coming out of Africa, bro, is fragmented. That does not dilute what it is. I beat Dr. Reggie up on that on the HOK. There's a whole study at Harvard and Yale and Oxford devoted to studying of fragments. Fragments does not mean a document is not valid or it doesn't exist. It just doesn't, fam. It just doesn't. But I welcome the back and forth, man. People are welcome to come on. I'm just pressed for time, so I'm getting ready to close down, man. I'll put out. Stop it, bro. Talking about you don't have the rest. Stop it, bro. Listen, bro. We don't have none of the most of what we know about people like Aristotle and all of these people that we read all often. Most of what we have that survived to them came from their students' hand notes. So that's not even an argument based on what's valid. You know what I'm saying? So talking about what's a fragment does not dismiss what we know to be true. It does not dismiss the thought and the understanding. It does not dismiss the cultural context. It does not dismiss the culture. It doesn't, right? So, like these are arguments, bro. Y'all no longer can hold on to. But again, I appreciate all those who tuned in, man. I really do. I really do. Shout out to you, brother Dr. Rob came in the building today, man. Appreciate you, man. Yerm Yahoo Israel, as always. Appreciate you, family. All praises to the Most High. Sakara, Patrice Bishop, shout out to you as well. Peace and blessings to you, family. Rockman from the Virgin Islands, shout out to you, fam. Always. I do see you, Rockman, often, bro. I see you, bro, with your information at times, bro, when you come around. I see you. Respect to you, family. Man, shout out, man, to Yahweh War Machine. Shout out to the Prince of Yahweh. Shout out, man, to KOT. Shalom, fam. Shalom to you, Marquise the Samaritan. Shout out to you, family. Glad to see you in the building again. King Kofi, peace to you, fam. My favorite 40-year-old Ghanaian orphan. Shout out to you, fam. My favorite 40-year-old Ghanaian orphan. What's good to you, fam? King Kofi, man. Shout out to you, fam. Shalom. Afro-Asiatic 19. Peace to you, fam. Always great information from that brother. Sister Natalie, Queen Naftali. Peace to you, family. Peace to you. I appreciate you being in the building. Most High bless. Appreciate your scholarship, sis. Keep putting in that work. It's much appreciated. It's much needed. If they ain't talking about you, sis, then you ain't doing it right. So keep it going. Keep it going. Keep it going. Keep it going. All right. So that's it, man. That's going to conclude this segment today. And you guys be blessed. And if you think I'm playing with this information, don't play with me, because this is what you're going to get.
Bitch, you will never live. Your kids will never live. Your wife will never live. Your dog will never live. Because if me and my kids can't live, you can't live. And I swear to God, nigga, I'm nicer than Korea with this combat knife. So if you run up on me, you better be ready. You better be about that life.
Peace.